All right. Now, I shared this last time. I'm going to share it one more time. I am not a... Oh, dear. Where'd the slides go? I will do my best. There we go. I will do my best to communicate if I don't have slides, but the slides do make things much more clear. The class is much better with them. I mentioned this last Sunday. I'll mention it again. Your pastor is not a medievalist when it comes to his study of church history. I really feel like the areas of church history that I am most prepared to teach are early modern, where we're talking about the Reformation, where we're talking about particularly the early revivals and renewal movements in the church, such as Pietism, Wesleyanism, the evangelical revivals of the 17 and 1800s. I feel like that is where I'm most comfortable. I feel comfortable talking about the fathers of the church, but the medieval church is certainly not an area where I'm an expert. And so just bear with me as I teach through this material. There may very well be some things that you ask me that I may have to get back to you and say, I don't know the answer to that, but I will find an answer for you. But I think it's really, really important for us to understand at least a little bit of what the medieval church looked like. Because we need to understand the medieval church and the papacy, particularly the Western medieval church, because this is the tradition that we come out of as Protestants. If we are going to understand our tradition, we need to understand the factors that created our tradition, the Protestant tradition. That doesn't mean that we have to be experts about the medieval period, about the medieval church, to really understand the Reformation, though it can be incredibly helpful. But nevertheless, we do need to have at least a working knowledge of what was going on in the medieval period, what the church looked like in Western Europe just before the Reformation. And one of the things that is very much a factor, in Martin Luther's time, especially in Western Europe, is the papacy is incredibly powerful, has massive influence over Western Europe, and thereby the world, because you have to remember, by Martin Luther's time, European countries, they are colonizing the New World. And so the Pope is quite literally one of the most powerful figures in the whole world in Western Europe. And frankly, some people would even still argue that the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, is still one of the world's most influential figures. I think a good argument can be made for that. The Pope represents and speaks for the largest body of people that claim the name of Christ of anybody in the world. So I think a good argument can be made for that. And one of the things that we've been talking about is how did the papacy, we talked about this last week, how did the papacy become so powerful, so influential? How do we get to a point to where when the Pope says that Martin Luther needs to be burned at the stake, that his writings need to be confiscated and burned, how do we get to the point to where many, many Europeans are going to listen and are going to follow through on that? How did we get to this point? How did the Bishop of Rome become so powerful? How did this institution that had such influence in the medieval Roman Catholic Church, how did it get there? That's what we've been talking about, because it's going to play a major role. This institution is going to play a major role in the Reformation. It's going to play a major role in the creation of the Protestant tradition of which we are a part. And furthermore, we need to understand how the papacy got to a position of such influence, because the papacy remains influential. The Bishop of Rome remains influential throughout the world. He remains a very influential church figure. How did the papacy become so powerful? Well, as I said, it is a very long story. Now, because pretty much everybody that's here this Sunday was here last Sunday, I'm going to try and cover what I covered last Sunday relatively quickly. But if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer those questions. One of the things that I shared last Sunday with y'all that helps Rome, the church at Rome, grow in its prestige is early on the church in Rome is associated with the Apostle Peter. And some people are going to even argue that Peter was martyred in Rome and that he established that church. And I'm actually quoting the Roman Catholic document Pastor Aeternus, which is the Roman Catholic theological document that talks about the role of the Pope and specifically papal infallibility. They're going to say that Peter is going to establish the church at Rome with his blood. Irenaeus of Lyons, an early churchman, someone who I have talked about admiringly in this class, someone who is going to push back very strongly against the Gnostic heresy. He's going to be one of the very first people to say that Peter was the Bishop of Rome. Now, I am not saying that Peter absolutely was not ever in Rome. I'm not saying that he was not killed in Rome. I'm not saying that he was not the Bishop of Rome. But I will say this. The first century evidence for Peter being in Rome is very slim. We have very little first century, or what we would call primary source evidence. So as historians, whenever we do our work, if we want to write accurately about a particular time period, or we want to write accurately about a particular person from a particular time period, we want to gather as many primary sources as we possibly can. And frankly, the primary sources that connect Peter to the church at Rome are very slim indeed. We do have 1 Peter 5:12 through 14, where the author of 1 Peter, who we presume was the Apostle Peter, he speaks of writing from Babylon in this letter. Now, it is true that the early church oftentimes called Rome Babylon. They took to calling Rome Babylon because of all the wickedness they associated with the city, and because Rome was actively persecuting Christians even by the first century. It is possible, therefore, that Peter was in Rome. But because this document does not specifically mention him being in Rome, and because there are no other first century documents, no scriptural documents, no primary source documents that mention Peter being in Rome, what I will say is, I think it's an open question, Peter's association with Rome. To be fair, early on in the 2nd century, with people like Irenaeus, other writers, early on in the 2nd century, so many decades after Peter's death, there is a strong tradition that is developing that Peter had some kind of a connection with the church at Rome. So I don't want to discount it entirely, but to me, I think it still is one of history's mysteries, if you will, whether Peter really was in Rome. I think that's still an open question. And again, I'm just trying to be very fair there because there's not a lot of primary source evidence that supports it, but there is a lot of church tradition that supports it. And I don't want to say that that is wholly inaccurate. I think a lot of times church tradition can be very accurate. Hang on, I skipped ahead too quickly. One of the things that is going to help the church in Rome grow in its authority is, and particularly the papacy grow in its authority, is many people in the Roman church, they're going to begin to argue that in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 20, you'll remember I preached on part of that passage last Sunday. Many people who are in the Roman church, who look to the Roman church for leadership, who look to the Pope for leadership, they're going to begin to appeal to Matthew chapter 16, where seemingly Jesus calls Peter the rock. Now, of course, how that passage should be properly interpreted is a source of disagreement amongst biblical scholars and church historians. But nevertheless, what I'm simply trying to share with you today, since we already talked about the biblical data last week, is that many people in the Roman church and people who support the leadership of the Roman church, they begin to turn to passages like this one, appeal to passages like this one, to say that the Bishop of Rome has a special authority over all the other bishops in the world. The other passage I have up there is the Gospel of John chapter 21, where Jesus exhorts Peter to feed my sheep, feed my lambs, tend my lambs. So Roman Catholic theologians and biblical scholars are going to argue that what Jesus was giving Peter there was sort of a teaching and pastoral authority over the whole world's sheep, over the whole world's lambs. Now, I'm not Roman Catholic. I'm an ordained minister of the Christian and Missionary Alliance, a Protestant tradition. So I'm not saying that this is how I would interpret these passages. Again, I think it's quite a stretch to get from what from what Jesus is saying in the Gospel of John to the Roman Catholic position that Peter is given, and therefore his successors are given worldwide pastoral authority over all Christians. I think that's a major exegetical stretch. What I'm simply sharing is these are the passages that Christians will begin appealing to support the authority of the Bishop of Rome. Now, what I do want you to understand is we really don't see the bishops of Rome and Christians appealing to these passages in this way until at least the 3rd century. I have not found any references to these scriptures being interpreted this way in the 2nd century. This seems to be a 3rd century development. So we're already centuries removed from Jesus, from the New Testament's composition. We're a long way down the road whenever these arguments begin to appear. And what I would say as well is even by the time, you'll remember I mentioned a dispute that arose between Pope Stephen and the Carthaginian bishop, St. Cyprian. They were debating as to whether people who had been baptized by heretics were rightly baptized. And Pope Stephen is going to come in and say, well, as long as they were baptized in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, they were biblically baptized, they were rightly baptized. It doesn't matter if that person believes some things that were wrong. Cyprian is going to disagree with this. But Pope Stephen, he is going to appeal to some of these passages in the Gospels that I just mentioned as an argument for why Cyprian needs to listen to him, why Cyprian needs to obey in this instance. Now, theologically, I think Stephen was absolutely right here. I'm with the Bishop of Rome on this one. I think he got it right. But I don't know that I would have necessarily appealed to these passages in this way to make this theological argument. One of the interesting things is whenever Stephen begins using these arguments for his position to assert his authority, what is interesting is we do have some Christians from this era who begin to say, we have never heard these scriptures interpreted in this way before. This is a novel interpretation for us. So what I'm saying is I think a good argument can be made that the earliest Christians would not have interpreted the Gospel of Matthew in this way. I think this is a relatively later development. I'll stop there in case there are any questions. And again, I'm just trying to summarize what I talked about last week. So if I left anything out and you have any questions, does anybody have any questions so far? Or am I as clear as mud? Okay, let's keep rolling then, unless there's any questions. So one of the other things that's going to help Rome grow in influence and the papacy grow in influence is Rome's unique position of being the only church in the West, particularly Western Europe, that could boast of being founded by an apostle. And this is automatically going to earn it some deference and some respect. Early on in the church's history, several different churches are going to distinguish themselves. Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople much later, not until the time of Constantine. But early on, churches in the empire, in the Roman Empire, are going to distinguish themselves because they are going to claim to have been founded by an apostle. And some of them, I think, actually have pretty good claims to being founded by an apostle. And so early on, these churches, they are going to be given greater deference and respect by smaller churches, by other churches in the empire, because these churches will at least claim to trace their lineage back, their founding back to an apostle. Rome is in a unique position because, as you can see, most of these other, what the church begins to call apostolic sees, okay? Apostolic sees, okay? That is a church founded, a diocese founded by an apostle. As you can see, Rome is unique in that it is the only one in the West that is supposedly founded by an apostle. That's going to give Rome a leg up in the West. It's It's going to help it carve out a position of greater authority than other churches in the West. Something else that is going to help the Roman Church and the papacy in particular grow in its power is the Roman Church is going to play an extremely active role in evangelizing Western Europe. What you have here in this picture, in this artist rendering, is you actually have St. Augustine here, not the St. Augustine who wrote Confessions, but another St. Augustine. He was a missionary sponsored by the Western Roman Catholic Church, by the papacy. Augustine's mission to the British people is going to be sponsored by the papacy, is going to be supported by the papacy. And many other missions in Western Europe that are going to go to places like modern-day France, modern-day Germany, so on and so forth, many other missions are going to be supported by the papacy. And so for this reason, many younger churches, many of them founded by the papacy, they're going to begin to see Rome as sort of the mother church. So naturally, they're going to look to her for leadership. Okay? It's pretty much what we got to last Sunday. That's pretty much where we stopped. So I do want to ask, are there any questions before I jump into the new material? Anything at all? Okay. All right then. So, something else that is going to help the papacy grow in power. You'll remember that much of this class, the early portion of this class, was taken up with talking about the early councils of the church. And the first four ecumenical councils, and whenever I say ecumenical, what that means is that comes from the Greek word oikumene, which means universal, worldwide. Protestants even look to the first four ecumenical councils of the church for guidance in our theology. Tonight at our candlelight service, we are going to say the Nicene Creed, which came out of the Council of Nicaea, okay? And that is still a document, that is still a creed, a confession that continues to unite the vast majority of the world's Christians. And so these early councils of the church that we spent a lot of time talking about, they continue to influence Christians right up until the present day. They continue to shape our theology right up until the present day. You would be hard-pressed to find a Protestant theologian who would have much to disagree with in the first four ecumenical councils. The vast majority of Protestants have a great deal of respect for these first four ecumenical councils, which mostly focused on the person of Christ, talking about how does the deity and the humanity of Christ work together. What do we believe as Christians about the person of Christ? And of course, these councils are also going to produce the Nicene Creed, the first two in particular, which again is a document, is a creed, something that we all confess together that continues to unite the vast majority of Christians. The bishops of Rome are going to play a very unique role in these early church councils. It's interesting. Even though the early councils of the church, these first four ecumenicals, are going to be dominated by the East, the vast majority of the representatives, they come from what we would now call the eastern section of the Roman Empire. They're coming from places like Egypt, the Middle East, Turkey, Greece. The vast majority of people represented at the council are going to be Eastern Christian voices. It's true that the Bishop of Rome is going to send legates or representatives to sort of speak for him in his place, but the Western Church is going to have a fairly small, in terms of the numbers of people there, it's going to have fairly small representation at these councils. However, you remember these different churches that I talked about, oftentimes in the debates, the theological debates that are going on at these councils, the various bishops and leaders of these different apostolic churches, apostolic sees, like Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem, Constantinople, oftentimes these bishops are going to say, I have more authority than everybody else because my church was founded by an apostle. And oftentimes these churches will get into these deadlocks where they can't move forward as to what they should believe and say in these councils. And so oftentimes what the Eastern Christian bishops and pastors are forced to do is to break the deadlock as they appeal to the Bishop of Rome. And oftentimes it would give these bishops a leg up. Okay, if I can get another leading bishop, particularly the Bishop of Rome, to agree with me on my position, there's a better chance, of my position winning out at the council. And so even though the Bishop of Rome is fairly removed from a lot of these debates, even though that's the case, oftentimes these Eastern Christian bishops and pastors are going to appeal to the Bishop of Rome to help them solve the theological problems of the church, which of course is going to raise the prestige of the church at Rome and of the papacy in particular. One of the things that we talked about in an earlier lesson in our church history course is we talked about the Council of Chalcedon, which was the fourth ecumenical council. At the Council of Chalcedon, the bishops, the church is debating how does the humanity and the deity of Jesus Christ work together. And the Eastern bishops are going to appeal to the Bishop of Rome for some help in solving this situation. And Pope Leo is going to write a tome, a book, and it's all about solving this issue. What do we believe about the person of Jesus Christ? And it is going to play a major role in solving the debate at the Council of Chalcedon. And so all of these factors are helping the prestige of the church at Rome, the prestige of the Bishop of Rome steadily grow in people's minds. One of the things that's going to help, I think, the Bishop of Rome in all of this is, and several people have mentioned to me they're looking forward to talking about the schism that takes place between the Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church that still is with us to this day. I'll go ahead and mention this and keep this in your back pocket because it's part of what informs the schism. In the East, the way they do theology is far more speculative, is far more mystical, whereas in the West in terms of its theological attitude, approach, is far more dogmatic, is far more black and white. And you might imagine if at a council where you're debating theology and you got a bunch of mystics going round and round and round, and I'm oversimplifying here a little bit, you could imagine how the very black and white, very dogmatic Bishop of Rome speaking into this either through letters or through his legates, you could imagine how very quickly they might cut through the discussion and how many people might say, oh yeah, that's where I land. So these different attitudes towards theology and how theology should be done, that's going to play into the schism. So hold on to that. Hold on to that as we get into that discussion in the next few Sundays. But the Roman Church and the papacy in particular, they're going to play a major role in resolving some of the church's theological debates. And in particular, because the bishops of Rome almost invariably landed on the side of orthodoxy, the winning side, the Roman Church's prestige is going to grow immensely during the patristic era. Now, I am trying to simplify and summarize literally centuries of history. And so to be fair, many people would still reject some of the papacy's claims to be the pastor of the worldwide church. Many people in the East will say the Bishop of Rome has only a primacy of honor, but not a primacy of power and authority. So by no means do I want you to think that prior to the Reformation, everybody thought that the Bishop of Rome was the most powerful pastor in the church. By no means. The East is still not there. But many Christians are growing to respect the papacy more, the Bishop of Rome more, because of the major role that they're going to play in the doctrinal disputes of the church and how they're going to land on the side of orthodoxy. Any questions? Any comments? Thoughts? Virgil. Mm. Yeah. I guess what I would say is, so for the benefit of those watching online, I'm trying to do a better job of this because some people are watching online, they're just like, there's these great big gaps in your church history class. So I'm trying to do better on that. For the benefit of those who are online, some people in here are murmuring in agreement with you, Virgil, and Virgil is sharing that, a lot of this discussion just doesn't seem very Christian. It seems like the church has, devolved into very political organization where bishops are jockeying for power. And I will say, Virgil, I have to agree with you to a large degree. I guess what I would say, to be fair, we have to remember that the church is very new at this. It's still finding its footing. How do we exist in this world as we await the return of Christ? And even Millard Erickson, a great Protestant theologian, I like what he says. The New Testament gives us less information about how we're to govern the church than we all would probably like. I would like a little bit more black and white instructions. So I would say, to be fair, the church is trying to figure out how to rightly govern itself, how to rightly protect the truth. But I will say also, to your point, I think it's okay if a lot of this makes us uncomfortable. One of the things that I shared with y'all at the beginning of this class is we're going to be talking about the good, the bad, and the ugly of church history. And let's be real. Power struggle, jockeying between bishops for power and influence and authority, it very much plays a role in things. But I'll just say this to conclude this part of the discussion. Unless people want to keep going in this direction, we can certainly keep discussing. God has never used a perfect organization to accomplish his purposes. God has never used a perfect organization. I love this tradition that we're all a part of, the Christian Missionary Alliance. But it's not a perfect structure. It's not a perfect organization. There's no such thing as a perfect church structure. It's not out there. I think we will be discouraged and depressed if we looked for that. But I resonate with a lot of what you're saying. It just doesn't sound very Christian, this sort of jockeying and fighting for power and influence. Ron, I think you had a comment, right?
Yeah, but it's probably premature.
Okay.
His comments are always
I tell you, I mean, if I were Virgil, I'd be a little hurt because you're letting me get there at the right time, but you always jump ahead of Virgil. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding, Ron.
I'll just say this.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Treat everybody fairly.
Having served in the country as Roman Catholic dominant,
Mm-hmm.
in our training with the believers,
Mm-hmm.
the issue of the papacy, we had to delve into,
Mm-hmm.
because that's always their question too. And so, of course, we would always go back to the scriptures about what we think the interpretation is. I won't get into that right now, but that's what we had to do as part of the discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody that's had the Roman Catholic background.
Yes. Yeah. And what I would say too is one of the reasons why we need to understand this is because just about half of the world's Christians, a little more than half probably, I'm trying to remember my numbers here, but a little more than half of the world's Christians believe in the authority of the papacy. So we need to be familiar with this and be able to dialogue with our brothers and sisters who do accept the papacy. Any other questions here? Any other comments? Okay. This may also help explain why we see the papacy making very strong claims for itself. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, and this is an artist's rendering of the fall of Rome. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD is going to create a massive power vacuum in the world. I mean, to put this into perspective, guys, this would be a world-changing event on the level of something like this, half of the United States being conquered, and the United States power in this world being quickly decimated. This is a earth-shattering event because for centuries, the Roman world has dominated the Mediterranean world and brought stability and peace to much of the world. And so the fall of the Western Roman Empire, we can probably scarcely contemplate how much this would have impacted the world. The closest thing we have in our minds that would be similar to this would be potentially something that we might remember. Some of y'all lived through the breakup of the British Empire. You know, this might be the closest analog to that. But the difference is, as the British Empire was falling apart, the American Empire, if we want to call it that, was able to take over Britain's obligations and was able to stabilize the world in the 20th century and in the 21st century. That does not happen in Western Europe. Whenever the Roman Empire falls in Western Europe falls into chaos. And the barbarian tribes that were eating at Rome's borders for centuries and centuries that the Romans regularly had to do war against, the barbarians and the Roman Catholic Church are what is left to try and bring some order back to the mess that is Western Europe. Now, you might understand why the Roman Catholic Church would want to make very strong claims for itself whenever the two powers left in Western Europe, for the most part, are the bloodthirsty barbarians. Because the way they did things, it was he who is the strongest, he who is the mightiest, he who has the most men and weapons wins. That is their understanding of how politics and society should work. You might understand why the Roman Catholic Church, why the papacy, with a more enlightened view of how society is supposed to work, with a more enlightened view of the value of human life, you might understand why the papacy would make very strong claims for itself, to insert itself into the conversation, and to try and help put Europe back together, to try and help Europe from getting more chaotic and more violent. And I will say, oftentimes an overlooked aspect of the Roman Catholic Church's influence on Western Europe in the medieval period is how much the Roman Catholic Church worked to stem the tide of violence in Western Europe. I think oftentimes Protestants do overlook that benefit of the Roman Catholic Church. In large part, the Roman Catholic Church is going to try and play peacemaker, sometimes more effectively, sometimes less effectively. But that is the role that the Roman Catholic Church is going to find itself in, step into, because again, in the Western world, it's a mess. It's a mess. With the Roman Empire gone, there's this massive power vacuum, and it's chaos in Western Europe. The barbarians are constantly fighting each other, carving out different kingdoms, and the church is doing everything it can to sort of put Europe back together. Oh, sure. Oh, sure. Up until the time of Charlemagne, things were pretty dark in Western Europe. Not everywhere else in the world, but life was pretty brutal and pretty short in Western Europe oftentimes if you lived between about this time and about 800 or so. Any other thoughts? Okay, let me keep going. During this time, and again, bear with me, I am literally teaching centuries of history in a 45-minute class, so I'm oversimplifying a lot here, a lot. During this chaotic period, one of the people groups that the papacy is going to actively reach out to and evangelize and ultimately form an alliance with is a group of people called the Franks. The Franks are a tribe, a barbarian tribe from Western Europe. They're a fierce warrior race. The blue sections there on the map of Europe, that is the Frankish Empire at its height, at its most powerful. The Franks are the ancestors of the modern-day French people. The Franks are a powerful warrior race in Western Europe, and they're quickly emerging as the greatest power in Western Europe. And fortunately for the papacy, their leader, Pepin the Short, is ultimately going to convert to what we would call Nicene Christianity. Yeah, how would you like to be known throughout history as Pepin the Short? But anyway, which he probably was a pretty short fella, because back then even tall men oftentimes were under 6 foot. It was very rare in the medieval period to find a man who was more than 6 foot. I remember Allison and I, we went into a restaurant, a pub in Oxford, built in the medieval period. And it was built, I want to say, around, what was it, 1100, 1200, Allie? Right around then. And I remember it was remarkable because the average European male was 5 foot, 5'5", 5'6". Oftentimes, if you were a woman, you would have been under 5 foot tall. Poor Pepin, he probably would have been 4'9", 4'10", 4'11", something like that. But I remember going into this pub that was built in the medieval period, and literally I had about an inch above me in terms of the ceiling. And there were some men in there who were getting a drink and getting something to eat who were like David Chester's height. So we're talking like 6'4", 6'5", and they were literally having to walk around like this in this old medieval building. And so Pepin would have been a small guy, but what he's known for primarily is forging this alliance with the papacy because he is going to convert to Nicene Christianity, and along with that, many of his people, the Franks, are going to convert to Nicene Christianity. The papacy is going to actively forge an alliance with the Franks. They're going to forge a very close, very tight relationship with the Franks. Their hope is that they can Christianize and civilize them and bring some semblance of order back to Europe. Furthermore, the papacy is vulnerable. Italy is filled with barbarian tribes, and frankly, the papacy is quite happy. As you can see, the Frankish Empire at its height surrounded Rome. The bishops of Rome were quite happy to have Frankish warriors guarding them and keeping them safe against the barbarians of Europe. Understandably. Because if there's one thing that barbarians loved to do in the medieval period, it was to sack churches and take all the gold and all the silver and all the riches. And so you might understand why the Bishop of Rome would be very, very happy to forge an alliance with the Franks, who were a fierce warrior race, a group of people that one did not mess with lightly. Understand, however, this desire for a relationship does not go one way. The Frankish kings, they recognized their need for educated men, learned men to help them govern. And in the chaos that ensued after the fall of the Roman Empire, most of the wealthy and the landed and the educated, the elite of Roman society, many of them flee. Many of them flee to the Eastern Roman Empire, and some of the few people who are educated, who do actually have some understanding of how to govern, because the church has a system of churches and dioceses and so forth. Some of the only people that are left that know how to actually manage things, know how to lead, know how to run, and furthermore, even know how to write, know how to put together documents. Many of these Frankish kings, we would say that they're so primitive. Many of these guys, they don't know how to read or write. They're leaders because they're great warriors. Their family distinguished themselves as great warriors. That's what the barbarians honored. And so these Frankish kings recognized they're at a deficit. If their empire is going to long endure, if the Franks are going to dominate Western Europe, they're going to need the help of churchmen to do it. They need educated people who know how to manage money, know how to manage resources, who know how to read, who know how to write, men of wisdom, men of learning, if they're going to lead effectively. And so all of this is going to increase the prestige of the Bishop of Rome. The alliance between the Franks and the papacy is going to nearly peak with Charlemagne. Perhaps you've heard of him. Last week we mentioned him. Ultimately, the Pope is going to crown him not only King of the Franks, but Holy Roman Emperor in 800 on Christmas Day, just a few days from now. The alliance between the Franks and the papacy is going to nearly peak with Charlemagne making Alcuin of York, a churchman, one of his key advisors. Alcuin is one of my favorite figures from church history. Alcuin is an interesting figure because he was known for being small, pale, and fat, but a man of great learning and great wisdom. And he is going to play a major role in Charlemagne's court. Now, Charlemagne is still essentially a barbarian. This painting that we see here that shows Charlemagne on the throne, surrounded by churchmen, one of who is Alcuin, this is a very romanticized vision of what Charlemagne's court might have looked like. Charlemagne is a great warrior, is an enlightened barbarian, but a barbarian nonetheless. And he recognizes he needs churchmen to sort of smooth off his rougher edges. Charlemagne is going to take his Christianity very seriously, but not in the way that we would want to take it seriously, perhaps. I do think he was genuinely a Christian. I do think he was genuinely converted. But I do think he was oftentimes misguided. Charlemagne is going to be a great warrior king. He's going to lead the Frankish Empire to its height. And he is going to conquer a group of Angles and Saxons. He's going to conquer a group of Anglo-Saxons, which of course they're going to settle the British Isles. He's going to conquer a group of Anglo-Saxons. And because Charlemagne is a Christian king, a Nicene king, he accepts the Nicene Creed, he is going to say to these Anglo-Saxons, convert to Nicene Christianity or I'll kill all of you. And we're talking thousands of Anglo-Saxons. And again, Charlemagne feels like he's doing the Christian thing by bringing more people into the fold. Very effective. Well, it's not. It's not, as I'll share in just a moment. Ultimately, the vast majority of these Anglo-Saxons are going to refuse. And so Charlemagne, being a good barbarian, is going to slaughter every single one of them. Alcuin of York, who was not at the battle at this time, gets wind of this. And I got to say, Alcuin of York shows his mettle here and shows his courage here, because he's actually going to rebuke Charlemagne for what he did. And he is going to share with Charlemagne, he's going to share with him this phrase that I think we all need to learn by heart. There is no compulsion in Christianity. There is no compulsion in Christianity. And what Alcuin is trying to get across to Charlemagne is, you you're far less likely to get a genuine conversion out of someone whenever you threaten them with either death or conversion. And so what I'm trying to argue here is Alcuin, he is in communion with the Bishop of Rome, influencing the Frankish court. All these things are helping the Roman Catholic Church grow in power, the papacy grow in power. But what I'm trying to show is, yes, there is the side that you pointed out, Virgil, the jockeying for power, the naked political ambition. But on the other hand, there is this side where I do think the church is doing its best to civilize what is a very uncivilized world. So I'm trying to show both the good, the bad, and the ugly. Yes, Matt?
So what you're saying is the church back then is kind of like it is today. Like there were real Christians in the church, and then there's some goats.
Oh, sure.
As well.
Yes, yes,
Goats and sheep, just like the Bible said.
yes.
Said Jesus was that.
For the benefit of those online, Matt just said the church of the medieval period is very much like the church today. There's sheep, there's goats. It's a mixed multitude, absolutely. There are genuine Christians. I think even some of the bishops who would claim some things that I would rather them not have claimed. I think many of them are genuine Christians. They're doing the best with what they have. Some of them are not genuine Christians. They're doing evil things. But it's a mixed bag. We're looking at the good, the bad, and the ugly of the church. Yes, Ron?
Again, in ministry in South America, many people that were originally Roman Catholic
Yes.
began to come to the gospel. We have different decades where we can see the gospel come over, and part of that was spurred because of the local Catholic leadership calling us demons
Mm.
and then threatening our lives.
Yeah.
If we go out in the war. But God had begun to do a work in some of the young people.
Mhm.
And they would look and see.
Yeah.
And, we don't have time right now, but one of the testimonies is about a man who would keep his father-in-law's Bible every once in a while because that father-in-law was authorized to have a Bible,
Right.
but nobody else common to keep it.
Yeah.
But anyway, long story, but he begins to look, and it's that same fear factor.
Mm. Mm.
You obey and stay below this umbrella,
Mhm.
or you're out.
Yeah.
Ostracized from the family, someone in their lives, what do you think?
Yeah.
Sorry, but
Yeah. Yeah.
anyway, so it's the same idea that the force, what was the quote?
There's no compulsion in Christianity. Yeah. 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 So appreciate that anecdote there, Ron, just sort of reinforcing what I'm trying to get across here, that Alcuin's right. Jesus meant for us to spread the message of the gospel with persuasion, with preaching, with evangelism, rather than with force. Again, I'm not saying what Charlemagne did was right. I'm merely saying it was understandable because he was a barbarian. That's how he's wired. That's how he's raised. And the church is is very much trying to Christianize these people and say, no, there is a better way. Now, sadly, the church doesn't always get it right. And sometimes the church foments violence and feeds into violence. But at least at this point in history, the church is restraining violence. And in the medieval period, the church is going to do that from time to time in some very, very tangible ways. I know we're a little over time, but I want to just get to my last few slides because we're almost done. This relationship between the papacy and the Franks is absolutely going to peak when Pope Leo III is going to crown Charlemagne not just king of the Franks, but emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire on Christmas Day in 800 AD. And that is what is depicted here. Now I want you to imagine this, guys. This would be the equivalent, and maybe even more so, maybe this is putting it mildly. This would be the equivalent of a prominent pastor, a Billy Graham, a John MacArthur, a Roman Catholic bishop in our country. This would be the equivalent of them administering the oath of office to our president. This is a big deal, what is going on here. And really and truly, what the papacy is saying whenever they crown Charlemagne is they are saying, we're not only sort of the pastor over all the faithful, all the Christian faithful, but they're saying that we even have a leadership role in the secular affairs of government. And perhaps even we're over and above all the Christian rulers of Europe, is what they're saying. Which gets us to the period right before the Reformation. Obviously, the kings of Christian Europe, they're going to resent the meddling of the papacy from time to time. It's going to be a tug of war between the papacy and the kings of Christian Europe as to where one's authority begins and ends. But nevertheless, this relationship, this tight, close relationship between the church and the state is going to shape the political and religious landscape of Europe until the Reformation and beyond, even up until the present day. And as hopefully you've seen, there's some maybe some good things that came out of that, but also some negative things that came out of that. I know we're way over time, but any final thoughts, comments, questions? I will allow it because I think it's valuable given the importance of this discussion. Any final thoughts or comments or questions? And if you don't right now, we can always pick up this discussion next week whenever we gather and study church history. Anything at all? All right then. Let's go ahead and wrap things up. Brother Phil Gruber, would you close us in prayer today, and then we'll transition to our worship service. Thank you.